Junior's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob of his neighbor's house. Just 6 months ago, Auntie Jennifer's door had seemed like a sanctuary from his lonely afternoons. Now it was the entrance to his nightmares. But that was the thing about monsters. Sometimes they live next door, hiding behind warm smiles and fresh-baked cookies. Then the story could flash back. 6 months earlier, the afternoon sun cast long shadows. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the empty living room as Junior turned his key in the lock. At 10 years old, he had mastered the routine. Backpack by the door, shoes neatly arranged, homework spread across the dining table. The house echoed with the familiar silence that awaited him every day at 3 p.m. In the bustling market across town, his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Aki, worked tirelessly at their shop. As Mrs. Aki arranged colorful fabrics on the shelves, her thoughts drifted to her son, alone at home. She pushed away the gnawing guilt, reminding herself that their hard work was all for him, for his education, his future, his dreams. Mr. Aki, counting the day's earnings behind the counter, shared her unspoken worry, though neither voiced it aloud. Junior was a bright child, finding joy in the simple pleasures of football matches during school breaks, and losing himself in storybooks that transported him far from his solitary afternoons. His teachers praised his quick mind, and his friends enjoyed his company during school hours. But by 3 p.m., when the school bus dropped him home, his world shrank to the confines of their modest house. The 3 hours between his arrival and his mother's return stretched endlessly. Junior would wander from room to room, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Sometimes, he'd press his face against the window, watching other children play in the street with their caretakers nearby. He understood why his parents worked so hard. He'd overheard them discussing school fees and bills late at night. But understanding didn't fill the hollow spaces in his afternoons. "I'm so bored being at home alone," he finally confessed one evening, his voice small against the clinking of dinner plates. His mother paused, a flash of pain crossing her face. "We are sorry, Junior," she said softly. "It's only for 3 hours." His father added, "We must work hard to pay for your school fees and other things." They spoke of necessity and responsibility, of sacrifices and future rewards, but beneath their words lay a current of helplessness. What none of them knew was that their well-intentioned solution to Junior's loneliness would soon cast a long shadow over their lives. For now, though, they were simply a family doing their best, parents working to provide, a child learning to be brave, and all of them believing that love meant sacrifice. In the market, Mrs. Aki thought she had found the perfect answer to their dilemma. She had noticed their neighbor, Auntie Jennifer, a young woman with a ready smile and gentle manner. The seed of an idea took root in her mind, though she couldn't have known it would grow into something dark and twisted. For now, it seemed like the perfect solution to their problems. A trusted neighbor to watch over their precious son. Auntie Jennifer's house sat just next door, a modest dwelling with cheerful curtains and potted plants dotting the windowsills. To the outside world, she was the picture of neighborly warmth, a young woman in her late 20s with a smile that seemed to hold no shadows. The Akis had watched her for months, noting how she always greeted passersby with a friendly wave, how she helped old Mrs. Coffee with her groceries, how she seemed to radiate an aura of gentle kindness. What they couldn't see was the careful calculation behind her friendly gestures, the way her eyes lingered too long on children playing in the street, the practiced nature of her warmth. Auntie Jennifer had chosen this neighborhood deliberately, understanding that working parents often needed helping hands. That trust could be built with small kindnesses stacked like bricks into a wall of respectability. The first day Junior came to her house, she had everything prepared. The living room was spotless, cartoon channels preset on the television, and a plate of fresh cookies arranged perfectly on the coffee table. She knew exactly how to make a child feel welcome, how to create an atmosphere of safety and comfort. Mrs. Aki, dropping Junior off that first afternoon, felt a wave of relief seeing how organized and motherly Auntie Jennifer appeared. "Don't worry about a thing," Auntie Jennifer assured Mrs. Aki, her voice honey sweet. "Junior and I will have a wonderful time." She didn't mention how long she had waited for this opportunity, how carefully she had built her reputation in the neighborhood. As Mrs. Aki hurried back to the shop, Auntie Jennifer watched her leave with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Junior would come home from school to find Auntie Jennifer waiting with snacks and a warm welcome. She helped him with his homework, listened to his stories about school, and even bought him a new football, a gift that made his eyes light up with joy. His parents noticed how he seemed happier, more settled, and they congratulated themselves on finding such a perfect solution. But beneath the surface, something else was taking root. Auntie Jennifer watched Junior with growing intensity, noting his innocence, his trust, the way he had begun to lean into her hugs without hesitation. She was patient, understanding that trust was like a delicate flower that needed time to bloom fully. Each day, she pushed the boundaries a little further, a touch that lingered too long, a comment about keeping small secrets, a gradual reshaping of what Junior considered normal. What no one could see was the darkness that lived behind Auntie Jennifer's smiles, the calculated nature of her kindness. She had done this before, in other neighborhoods, with other children. She knew exactly how to build trust, how to create a world where inappropriate behavior could be normalized, how to ensure silence through a careful mixture of affection and subtle threats. Junior, still innocent in the ways of the world, didn't understand the significance of these small changes. He only knew that sometimes, when Auntie Jennifer smiled at him now, something felt different, a feeling he couldn't name, but that made his stomach twist slightly. But she was so kind, so generous, and his parents trusted her completely. Who was he to question the strange feelings that sometimes crept up his spine when she looked at him in certain ways? As the sun set each evening, casting long shadows through Auntie Jennifer's living room, the mask she wore began to slip ever so slightly. Soon, she would introduce her special games. But for now, she continued to build her house of cards, one careful move at a time. The neighborhood continued its routine. Parents went to work, children played in the streets, and no one noticed the predator who had made herself at home among them, hiding behind curtains of respectability and a smile that never quite warmed her eyes. The afternoon that changed everything began like any other. Junior sat cross-legged on Auntie Jennifer's couch, homework completed, cartoons playing softly in the background. The shadows had begun their daily dance across the walls, and the house held its usual quiet comfort. But something was different in the way Auntie Jennifer watched him, her eyes holding a new intensity that made the air feel thick and strange. "Junior," she said, her voice honey-sweet, but somehow different. "Let's play a special game." The word special hung in the air between them, heavy with hidden meaning. In the kitchen, the clock ticked steadily, marking time in a world that was about to shift on its axis. Junior didn't know why his stomach suddenly felt like it was filled with stones, why his heart began to beat faster. What happened next would replay in Junior's mind for months to come. Unwanted touches, confusing instructions, the strange way Auntie Jennifer's voice changed. His mind struggled to process what was happening, trying to reconcile the kind neighbor who bought him gifts with this person who was doing things that felt so wrong. The cartoon characters on the television continued their cheerful adventures, their laughter a surreal backdrop to Junior's growing distress. In that moment, Junior's world split in two. There was the before, filled with football games and storybooks, simple loneliness that seemed manageable now in comparison. And there was the after, where nothing made sense anymore. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He wanted to say no, to run away, but the words stuck in his throat like glue. "This is our special secret," Auntie Jennifer whispered afterward, her smile now holding something that looked like a threat. "You don't want to make your parents sad, do you? They trust me to take care of you." The words wrapped around Junior like invisible chains, binding him to a silence that would grow heavier with each passing day. That night, in his own bed, Junior stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying everything like a broken record. His body felt wrong, dirty in a way that no amount of scrubbing during his evening bath had fixed. Down the hall, he could hear his parents talking about their day at the shop, their voices normal and unaware, while their son's world had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The changes began slowly but steadily. Junior's dreams became nightmares that woke him with a racing heart and wet sheets, something that hadn't happened since he was much younger. His bright eyes grew distant, his laughs became rare, and his once boundless energy drained away like water down a sink. At school, his favorite games held no appeal, and during football matches, he stood at the edge of the field, watching but not participating. His teacher, Mrs. Adabo, noticed the change but couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. She saw how he flinched at unexpected touches, how he stayed in at break time, drawing pictures of dark clouds and stormy seas. The children went through phases, she told herself, making a mental note to keep watching. At home, Junior's parents were too caught up in their daily struggles to notice the subtle shifts in their son's behavior. When they did spot something off, they attributed it to growing pains, to the natural moodiness of a child approaching his teens. They didn't see how he trembled slightly when Auntie Jennifer's name was mentioned, how he pushed his food around his plate instead of eating. Each afternoon became a countdown to torture. Junior would stand at Auntie Jennifer's door, his small hand shaking as he knocked, knowing what awaited him inside. The games grew more invasive, the threats more subtle, but more powerful. Your parents would be so disappointed, she would say. Or, no one would believe you anyway. Inside Junior's mind, a war raged between the need to tell someone and the paralyzing fear of what might happen if he did. The weight of the secret pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to be the bright, happy boy he used to be. He carried this burden alone, not knowing that his silent suffering was sending out signals that someone would eventually notice and understand. Mrs. Adabo had taught primary school for 15 years, long enough to recognize the shadows that sometimes cross children's faces. She watched Junior from her desk as he sat alone during break time, his untouched notebook open before him. The vibrant boy who once raised his hand for every question had retreated into a shell so thick she could almost see it surrounding him. In the staff room earlier that morning, she had discussed her concerns with the school counselor. It's more than just moodiness, she had explained, stirring her coffee absently. It's like watching a light slowly going out. The counselor had nodded, understanding the weight of those words from a teacher who rarely raised alarms without cause. Junior, meanwhile, sat at his desk, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach tighten as the clock ticked closer to afternoon. His mind wandered to the previous night, when he had tried to tell his mother about Auntie Jennifer. He remembered how she had been busy unpacking groceries, her tired voice dismissing his attempt with a "not now, please." The words he'd gathered so carefully had scattered like marbles on a tile floor, rolling away into dark corners where he couldn't retrieve them. Mrs. Adabo noticed how he lingered after class, organizing and reorganizing his pencils, reluctant to leave. She saw the way his hands trembled slightly, how his eyes darted toward the door like a trapped animal seeking escape. Making a decision, she gentle called out, "Junior, could you stay back for a moment?" The classroom fell silent as the last students filtered out. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Junior remained in his seat, his small shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Mrs. Adabo pulled a chair beside his desk, careful to maintain a comfortable distance. "Junior," she began softly, "I've noticed you haven't been yourself lately." She watched as his fingers twisted the corner of his notebook, creating tiny creases in the paper. "You know you can tell me anything, right? Anything at all." The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the seconds of silence that stretched between them. In Junior's mind, Auntie Jennifer's threats swirled like dark clouds, but something in Mrs. Adabo's gentle voice created a small crack in the wall of his silence. He started, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to go to Auntie Jennifer's anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Adabo stayed perfectly still, understanding that this moment was as delicate as a soap bubble. One wrong move could shatter it completely. "Can you tell me why?" she asked, her voice steady despite the dread building in her chest. She had seen this before, had attended workshops about these situations, but nothing truly prepared you for the moment when a child's trust hung by a thread. And then, like a dam breaking, the words began to flow. Junior spoke in broken sentences, his voice sometimes dropping so low Mrs. Adabo had to lean forward to hear. He told her about the special games, the threats, the confusion, the fear. As he spoke, tears rolled down his cheeks, but his voice grew stronger with each word, as if each confession lifted a tiny piece of the burden he'd been carrying. Mrs. Adabo felt her heart breaking even as her professional training kicked in. She knew exactly what needed to happen next, the carefully choreographed steps of intervention that would protect this child. But for now, she simply listened, understanding that this moment of being heard was perhaps the most important gift she could give him. Junior, she said when he finally fell silent, what happened to you is not your fault. None of it. And you are so brave for telling me. She saw something flicker in his eyes. Relief, perhaps, or the first fragile shoots of hope. In her mind, she was already planning the next steps. The meeting with the principal, the careful conversation with his parents, the involvement of child protection services. But she kept her voice calm as she added, we're going to help you, Junior. You're not alone anymore. Those words, not alone, seemed to release something in Junior. His shoulders shook as he began to cry in earnest. Not the quiet tears of before, but deep, body-racking sobs that spoke of weeks of pent-up fear and confusion. Mrs. Adabo resisted the urge to hug him, knowing that touch might not be welcome right now. Instead, she sat with him, a steady presence as the afternoon light slowly shifted, and the sound of children playing outside drifted through the windows. In that classroom, as the truth finally found its voice, both teacher and student understood that nothing would be the same after today. But sometimes, Mrs. Adabo knew, breaking apart was the first step toward healing. The path ahead would be difficult, but Junior had taken the hardest step. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, had begun to reclaim his power from those who had stolen it. The principal's office had never felt smaller than it did that afternoon. Mr. and Mrs. Aki sat rigid in their chairs, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Before them, the principal's desk seemed like an ocean, separating them from Mrs. Adabo, who sat with the weight of what she had to say pressing down on her shoulders. There's no easy way to tell you this, Mrs. Adabo began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. She watched as Mrs. Aki's fingers tightened around her husband's hand, as if bracing for a physical blow. Junior has shared something with me that requires immediate attention. As Mrs. Adabo spoke, carefully laying out what Junior had revealed, the room seemed to shrink even further. Mrs. Aki's free hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with horror and recognition. All those small signs she had dismissed, the bedwetting, the quietness, his reluctance to go next door, suddenly aligned like stars forming a terrible constellation. Mr. Aki's reaction was different. His face hardened into stone, but those who looked closely might have seen the muscle jumping in his jaw, the slight tremor in his shoulders that spoke of rage barely contained. In his mind, memories flickered like an old film. Junior trying to speak to him one evening, his own dismissive, not now, son, I'm tired. Oh God, Mrs. Aki whispered, her voice breaking. He tried to tell us. He tried. The words dissolved into a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a place where a mother's worst fears lived. Mr. Aki's arm went around her shoulders, though his own body was rigid with shock and mounting anger. The principal leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. What matters now is what we do next. Junior needs to know he's not alone, that he's believed, and that he's protected. She outlined the steps that would follow: the police report, the counseling, the support systems that would be put in place. Mrs. Adabo watched the parents carefully, recognizing the stages of grief and guilt washing over them in waves. She had seen it before: the self-recrimination, the anger, the desperate need to turn back time. Junior needs you to be strong right now, she added softly. He needs to know this isn't his fault, and it isn't yours either. Mr. Aki spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. Where is he now? The question held a universe of parental concern, of the primal need to protect, even if too late. He's with the school counselor, Mrs. Adabo assured them. He's safe. In the counselor's office, Junior sat quietly drawing, unaware of the meeting taking place. His picture showed a small figure surrounded by larger ones, all holding hands in a protective circle. The counselor, watching him draw, noted how his strokes were firmer now, how the colors he chose were brighter than the dark clouds he had been drawing for weeks. Back in the principal's office, The adults mapped out the path forward. Mrs. Aki wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and asked the question that had been burning in her throat. What do we do now? How do we help him heal? The principal shared a look with Mrs. Adabo before responding. First, we ensure his safety. That means reporting this to the authorities immediately. She paused, letting the weight of what would come next settle in the room. Then, we support him. All of us, family, school, counselors. Junior needs to know he's surrounded by people who believe him and will protect him. Mr. Aki nodded, his voice finding strength. We'll do whatever it takes. Whatever he needs. Mrs. Aki squeezed his hand, her tears now giving way to determination. They both understood that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to walk it, step by step, for their son. As they left the office to meet with Junior, Mrs. Adabo watched them go, seeing how they moved together now, united in purpose. Through the window, she could see the afternoon sun beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the school playground. But unlike the shadows that had haunted Junior for so long, these were just natural darkness, soon to be chased away by dawn. The police station stood solid and imposing in the early morning light, its brick walls holding countless stories of both justice and pain. Inside, Officer Sarah Mensa's office provided a gentler space, with its soft-colored walls and chairs sized for children. She had transformed this corner of the station into a place where young voices could speak their truths without fear. Junior sat between his parents, his small hand wrapped tightly in his mother's while his father's protective presence steadied him from the other side. Officer Mensa noticed how the family seemed to lean into each other, their bond strengthened by the storm they were weathering together. Junior, Officer Mensa began, her voice gentle but clear. Can you tell me about what happens at Auntie Jennifer's house? She had conducted hundreds of these interviews, but each one required the same delicate balance, gathering necessary information while protecting the child from further trauma. As Junior spoke, his voice sometimes dropping to a whisper, sometimes breaking entirely, Mrs. Aki felt each word like a physical blow, but she kept her face calm, her hands steady around her son's, even as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. Mr. Aki's jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically, his anger contained only by his love for his son and the knowledge that Junior needed his strength now more than ever. Across town, unaware of the gathering storm, Auntie Jennifer went about her morning routine. She watered her plants, straightened her curtains, and checked her phone, normal actions that seemed surreal in light of what was about to unfold. In her mind, she was untouchable, protected by the careful walls of respectability she had built around herself. The knock on her door came at precisely 10:47 a.m. Two officers stood on her doorstep, their badges catching the late morning sun. Miss Jennifer Adebayo, the male officer asked, his voice professionally neutral. We need to speak with you about a serious matter. The color drained from her face as realization dawned. Later, the officers would note in their report how quickly her carefully constructed facade crumbled, how the friendly neighbor persona fell away to reveal something darker underneath. As they led her away in handcuffs, curtains twitched in neighboring windows, and whispers began to spread through the community. Back at the station, Officer Mensa was finishing her interview with Junior. She watched as he drew another picture, this time of himself surrounded by police officers, teachers, and his parents, all forming a protective circle around him. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Children often expressed in art what they couldn't say in words. You've been very brave, Junior, she said, meaning every word. What happened wasn't your fault, and you did exactly the right thing by telling your teacher. She saw something shift in his expression, a small lightening of the burden he'd been carrying. Mr. and Mrs. Aki sat with the station's family liaison officer in another room, receiving guidance on what would happen next. The legal process would take time, they were told. There would be more interviews, statements to be taken, evidence to be gathered. But most importantly, there would be support, counseling for Junior, resources for the family, a network of professionals ready to help them navigate the path to healing. As they left the station that afternoon, the family stepped into sunlight that seemed different somehow, clearer, perhaps, or more hopeful. Junior walked between his parents, their hands linked in a chain of protection and love. They had a long journey ahead, but they would walk it together. In the days that followed, their neighborhood buzzed with the news. Other parents held their children closer, checked their safety networks, and began having difficult but necessary conversations about boundaries and speaking up. What had happened to Junior sparked a ripple effect of awareness and protection that spread through the community. At home that evening, Junior sat at the kitchen table while his mother cooked dinner, his father nearby reading the newspaper. The scene looked ordinary, but everything had changed. His mother hummed softly as she stirred the soup, her free hand occasionally reaching out to touch his shoulder, as if reassuring herself that he was there, that he was safe. His father had taken time off work, his presence a steady anchor in their recovering world. The darkness hadn't disappeared entirely. It never would, but it had been named, faced, and challenged. In its place, something new was growing: a stronger family bond, a network of support, and the first tender shoots of healing. 3 months had passed since that day at the police station. The seasons had shifted, bringing cooler winds and new beginnings. In Dr. Maya's office, where soft lights and gentle colors created a safe haven, Junior sat cross-legged on a comfortable chair, his hands busy with modeling clay as he spoke about his week. Dr. Maya watched him shape the clay into a soccer ball, noting how his movements had become more confident over their sessions together. The child before her was slowly emerging from his shell, like a butterfly testing its wings after a long transformation. "And how are the nightmares?" she asked gently, remembering the tearful sessions of early days. "Better," Junior replied, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I only had one this week, and when I woke up, my bed was dry." He said this last part with pride, and Dr. Maya smiled, understanding the significance of this milestone. The bedwetting that had plagued him had begun to subside, each dry night a small victory in his recovery. At home, changes had bloomed like spring flowers. Mr. Aki had rearranged his work schedule, ensuring either he or his wife was always home when Junior returned from school. The shop still needed attention, but they had hired help, understanding now that some prices were too high to pay for prosperity. Mrs. Aki had transformed Junior's room into a new sanctuary. Gone were the old curtains that had witnessed his silent suffering, replaced by bright blues and yellows that he had chosen himself. A small nightlight, shaped like a football, kept the darkness at bay, though Junior needed it less and less these days. In the evenings, they had started a new tradition. Instead of rushing through dinner to get back to work, the family lingered at the table, sharing stories about their days. Junior's voice, once hesitant, grew stronger in these moments, supported by his parents' undivided attention. At school, Mrs. Adabo watched Junior's gradual transformation with quiet satisfaction. The boy who had once hidden in the shadows of the playground now played football again, his laughter mixing with that of his friends. His hand had started to rise in class, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Yet healing wasn't a straight line. There were still days when shadows crossed Junior's face, moments when a random trigger would bring back unwanted memories. But now he had tools to handle these moments: breathing exercises Dr. Maya had taught him, the safety of his parents' presence, and most importantly, the knowledge that he could speak his fears aloud. One afternoon, as Junior kicked his football around the backyard, Mrs. Aki watched from the kitchen window. She saw more than just her son playing. She saw resilience in action, the triumph of spirit over trauma. The ball soared through the air, and Junior leaped to catch it, his body moving with a freedom that had been stolen but was now reclaimed. Inside the house, Mr. Aki sat at the dining table, reviewing papers from the ongoing legal proceedings. The system moved slowly, but purpose guided its pace. Auntie Jennifer remained in custody, and other families had come forward, their stories adding weight to the case against her. The community had been shaken, but from that upheaval had grown stronger networks of protection and awareness. In his weekly support group, Junior had found understanding in the eyes of other children who had survived similar experiences. They shared their stories, their fears, and their victories, each tale of healing strengthening the others. The counselor who led the group often remarked on Junior's progress, how he had begun to offer encouragement to newer members. Dr. Maya's words from their first session echoed in the family's journey: Healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning to carry it differently. The Akis had taken this to heart, creating new patterns while acknowledging the scars of the past. They had learned to recognize triggers, to provide space when Junior needed it, and to celebrate each step forward, no matter how small. As the sun set on another day of recovery, Junior sat at his desk, working on his homework. The football trophy he had won in last week's school tournament gleamed nearby, a symbol of his returning joy. His mother's voice called him to dinner, and he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. The path ahead still held challenges, but he walked it now with confidence, surrounded by love, understanding, and the strength that comes from surviving. 1 year had passed since that first brave conversation with Mrs. Adibo. In the courthouse, where justice had finally been served, Junior stood between his parents, listening as the judge delivered the verdict. Auntie Jennifer would spend years behind bars, her crimes acknowledged, her power to harm stripped away. The family's testimony, along with others who had come forward, had ensured she would never hurt another child. Outside, beneath a sky that seemed endlessly blue, Junior felt something settle in his chest. Not an ending, exactly, but a turning of the page. Dr. Maya had taught him that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that would continue throughout his life. But now he had the tools, the support, and most importantly, his voice. In the neighborhood, changes rippled outward like waves in a pond. Parents had formed a community watch program, and the local school had implemented new safety protocols. Junior's story, though painful, had sparked a movement of awareness and protection that would safeguard other children for years to come. Mrs. Adabo, watching Junior in class now, sometimes caught her breath at the transformation. The boy who had once hidden in shadows now stood in sunlight, his hand raised high to answer questions, his laugh ringing clear across the playground. She had framed his thank you note, a reminder of the power of paying attention, of creating space for truth to emerge. At home, the Aki family had found a new rhythm. The shop still thrived, but with different priorities now. They had learned that success wasn't measured in hours worked or money earned, but in moments shared, in safety preserved, in love expressed. Their dinner table had become a place of stories, of dreams spoken aloud, of fears faced together. Junior's room, once a place of lonely afternoons, had transformed into a sanctuary. Football posters covered the walls, trophies lined his shelves, and his desk held both schoolwork and the journal Dr. Maya had encouraged him to keep. The nightlight still stood guard, though its services were needed less and less. In his support group, Junior had become something of a mentor to newer members. "It gets better," he would tell them, his voice gentle but firm. Not all at once, but little by little. He understood now that his story could be a light for others finding their way through darkness. Mr. and Mrs. Aki had their own journey of healing. They had learned to listen differently, to watch more carefully, to create space for difficult conversations. Their guilt had transformed into purpose, their fear into determination to protect not just their son, but all children within their reach. On a bright Saturday morning, Junior stood on the football field, his team around him, his parents cheering from the sidelines. As he moved across the field, his body strong and sure, he felt the sun on his face and smiled. The ball came toward him, and he kicked with all his might, sending it soaring toward the goal. In that moment, suspended between earth and sky, the ball carried more than just the hopes of scoring. It carried the truth that healing was possible, that darkness could be overcome, that speaking up could save not just one life but many. As his teammates cheered the goal, Junior felt the fullness of his journey, from silence to voice, from fear to strength, from victim to survivor. Later that evening, as the family walked home together, their shadows stretched long behind them in the setting sun. But these were natural shadows, holding no fear, telling the simple story of light meeting earth. Junior walked between his parents, his steps sure and steady, knowing that while his story would always be part of him, it no longer defined him. In the quiet of his room that night, Junior wrote in his journal, adding to the collection of thoughts that marked his path to healing. "Today," he wrote, "I felt completely free." And in those words lay the greatest victory of all. Not that the past had been erased, but that it had been transformed into wisdom, into strength, into hope for others who might need to find their voice. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, their light steady and true. In houses across the neighborhood, families held their children closer, listened more carefully, loved more consciously. And in one particular house, a boy who had found his courage slept peacefully, his dreams no longer haunted, his future bright with possibilities.